Hello, and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today, ladies and gentlemen, and everyone in between, I am joined by a good friend of mine, an expert in children's and young adult fiction, someone who I know, respect, and love, Dr. Rodney Fierce. Hello, Rodney.
Hello, thank you for having me.
It is, I have to point out to people, we haven't seen each other in person for a long time. And it is so good. It is so good to see you. Because what people don't realize is we were meant to start recording ages ago, and we've spent over an hour and a half, 2 hours catching up and chatting. And it's just been fantastic. So it's really good to see you, Rodney.
Likewise.
Now, the reason we are chatting today is because someone had posed a question on my channel asking about young adult and children's fiction as genres and how they differed from, the science fiction and fantasy and the stuff that I generally look at. And I didn't feel qualified to talk about genre distinctions for young adult and children's fiction because I have a general conception, but it's not an area I've studied. And it's important when you don't know something to actually ask someone who does. So that's why I've dragged you on the channel, Rodney.
I am happy to be dragged here. And I'm happy to talk about that question. I think it's a complicated answer to that question. And I think depending on who you talk to in the children's literature world, they would have a different answer. And so on the one hand, you can say that the age to which the piece is directed, is that what makes it children's literature? On the one hand, yes, maybe it is. You can also say that a child as the protagonist makes it children's literature. Yes, but not always. And I'll give an example of what I mean by that. Harry Potter is children's fiction, and there's several reasons for that. Partly is that he is a child and we watch him mature. We're also dealing with coming of age and children's problems, and it is focused on the children. And then the situations that he's dealing with are also those that are meant for other children to identify with. So the world is child focused. And even though there are adults in the world, they're not the center of the world. They're on the periphery. And so I think that factors into the definition. But something like, say, Gone with the Wind is not considered children's fiction, even though Scarlett O'Hara is 16 when the book opens. And so even though she is technically a child, the book is not about her childhood. It is about the adulthood and the maturation, and her as an adult is the focus. And so I think those are some of the ways in which we distinguish what is what is at least children's fiction from what is adult fiction.
Yeah, because we see a lot of this in fantasy and science fiction, and how we defining science fiction is the bane of an academic's life. Because anytime you think you've come up with a definition, someone goes, "But what about all of these texts? Because these are clearly science fiction, and your definition of fantasy works for them." And trying to define things is important to academics, but because for most of us, when we look at something, we point at it and go, yeah, that looks like fantasy, that's what I mean. Or that looks like children's fiction. But something like Winnie the Pooh is ostensibly children's fiction because it can be read by a child, it can be understood by a child. But it has such strong resonance with an adult audience because when we read it as an adult, it has entirely different meanings, and it works on both levels. Mm-hmm. And so it's weird that we define some genres by almost their content, what they are focused on, like fantasy, science fiction, horror, the effects that they're trying to create in the reader. But with children's or young adult, we can go, well, it's a young adult science fiction, it's a young adult horror, it's a young adult fantasy. That young adult is referring to the age group almost it's aimed at. And then we get into, and it's kind of tricky. How do we think about that? When we say it's aimed at that audience, that's author intention. But yes. Is it reflected in the prose style? Is it reflected in the level of prose?
I would say that it can be, but isn't necessarily. And by that I mean, so if I use Harry Potter again as the example, J.K. Rowling is writing, and I think her writing style is geared toward children. but is the marketing and the packaging of the thing also geared toward them? And in this case, yes, those are both sort of aligned in that intention. But I think that part of what helps us define, I think you can't discount the production and the marketing of a work in how we define the genre. So I think there is the authorial intention. I think the prose style can be marketed to people who are of a certain age, but isn't always necessarily.
But here's the thing. So Harry Potter initially clearly starts out as children's fiction. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think everyone can agree that the very first Harry Potter book is children's fiction. But when we get to the end of the Harry Potter series, has it transitioned into young adult? Because the focus of those books, the tone of those books, the age of the protagonist, even the style, the length of the books, all of it has changed quite substantially from, like, if you did a comparison of the last book in Harry Potter to the first book in Harry Potter, they are actually radically different books. They're very different style, very different tone. So at what point does Harry Potter go from children's fiction to young adult?
My technical answer to that would be in book 4 in Harry Potter the Goblet of Fire, because book 4 or book 5, and I'll explain what I mean by that. So yes, I would classify that series as a seamless transition from children's literature into young adult literature, and partly because of the age of the protagonist. I think the length, the marketing, the packaging, all of it does that. And Rowling is an interesting test case because her core readers, her initial readers, aged with Harry, Ron, and Hermione as the books progress, which I think is fascinating. But also, books 4 breaks the traditional British schoolboy structure that has been the sort of focus of the original books, where Harry, you go from the ordinary place into the special world, and then for good or bad, he has to go home for the summer, and he has his adventures at school, and then he goes home. And book 4 breaks that, because it's the first time that he's meaningfully confronted with death. And so even though he goes home, he knows it's not going to be the same. And starting with book 5, the school structure of it begins to gradually fall away as they are in school sporadically, and then by the time we get to 6 and 7, not in school at all, as they're trying to figure out how to save school and save the world. And so I think by that point, we have sort of transitioned thematically into young adult. I also think, I mean, if you want to say that romance is a core of young adult rather than children's fiction, I would argue it's in both. But I think stereotypically we would put that more in young adult. And I think the romance in that series comes from book 4 with the Yule Ball sort of going forward as those characters are maturing sexually and romantically, and then also physically and emotionally.
Yeah, I mean, like Harry Potter is like I'm on record as not being a fan, but it's still an interesting work to look at. And you know, admittedly, my problem is I read Harry Potter very much through the lens of analyzing fantasy. So I'm looking at it from the fantasy genre rather than taking into consideration children's fiction and the different approaches that children's and young adult fiction take to fantasy stories, that I'm judging them by a different set of criteria.
That makes sense.
And you know, that's part of my problem. There are things I wouldn't let an adult fantasy novel get away with that happen in Harry Potter, and therefore I cannot excuse it in Harry Potter, even though they are actually very different things. But the dealing with concepts, because this is something that came up. One of my favorite young adult texts is a book called Junk by I think it's Melvin Burgess. Okay. And I think in the States it was called Smack.
Okay.
So if you think of the connotation of junk and smack, what it's referring to, that this dealt with as a young adult novel, and at the time it was sort of rather waggishly called Train Spotting for Kids, because it dealt with a very serious problem that was happening with school-age children in Bristol and the ramifications of that. And it's an incredibly powerful book. It is a very harrowing book, and it deals with some very adult themes, but the characters are all going through it. And when he wrote this book and has been interviewed repeatedly about it, he said, but this is something that these children are experiencing.
Mhm.
So I wrote about this childhood and teenage experience in this part of the world. This
Mhm.
is a children transitioning into young adult. And it's very difficult as an adult to read it because you think, no, children need to be protected from this kind of stuff. But it's an incredibly powerful book. And yet the prose he renders it in, he has, we talk about the difference in show and tell. He has a very telling style because it makes the text a lot more accessible. It makes it easier for an intended readership. So it's a very telling book. The language used to narrate the story is rendered into a not dumbed down, but a simplified lexicon that is easily understood with a lower level of literacy and education.
Okay.
Because you're aiming at a teenage audience or a young teenage audience. You don't give them erudite, esoteric language because that makes the book impenetrable.
Right.
So that's why I think prose and how stuff is narrated is actually a factor quite often in how I personally judge, if something is meant to be young adult or something is meant to be children's or adult.
And I think you should, because and when we're talking about authorial intent, are you writing something for children and about children, or are you using child characters? And I think that's where you see some of the difference between children's and young adult literature, which is meant to reflect them, teach them, guide them, help them, and then other works that have children's characters or even child protagonists where that's not what the focus is supposed to be. And so I'm trying to think of a good one.
Well, what about Oliver Twist?
And that's actually a perfect example. I was trying to think of something Victorian. That is a book, or Great Expectations, if we're going to do that as well, where we see Pip and Estella go from childhood into adulthood, or Oliver Twist doing the same thing. And those are books that employ child characters, but they're using the children to teach adults about their world and how it affects children. It's not teaching children about the world that children inhabit. And so the writing style of it, I mean, those were published in periodicals, so they were in, that type of form. But Dickens' prose, the situations the children are in, the way the children are discussed and talked about, telegraphs to you that this is an adult novel that has children in it. Mm-hmm. Even though it's called Oliver Twist, there's so many adult characters that are shaping him, forming him, abusing him, helping him, that it is about him, but it's about the world and the socio-political and economic politics that have allowed for what's happening to him to be happening. Same thing with Great Expectations and Pip and Estella. I would say, yes, Pip is the protagonist, but like Estella and Miss Havisham and these people who shaped those two young minds and bodies are as much a part to play as they are. They are sort of the cipher through which we see the way all of that happens, and we see the ills of that world. But I don't think it's not meant to reflect that for children. It's meant to use children as sympathetic, tragic, horrifying, amazing characters for adults to reflect on that.
Yeah, look, and it's weird when we think of children's, because I know you specialized in Victorian literature, but when we look at some of the Victorian novels, the language used in those novels, even though they were intended for children, to give to a child now is almost a bar to that child being able to access it, because our language has changed so radically.
Yes,
stylistically, even how any form of novel or story is told to us has changed so substantially since the Victorian era that almost like asking a child to read a Victorian novel that is intended for children, it's going to be in a lot of cases, very difficult for them.
I would say in some cases almost impossible. And it's funny because I have like all of them sort of behind me. The one that I would go to with this is J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan. Now, Peter Pan started as a play in 1904. He novelizes it in 1911, and both are publishing blockbusters. They make him one of the richest men in England. But I would argue that if you ask people where they know Peter Pan from, almost no one says the novel, and even fewer people are going to say the play. You might say the Mary Martin musical. You might say of course, the Disney film is sort of omnipresent there. And then there are a variety of Peter Pan adaptations. that people will point to. But if you look at the novel, and I love the novel, when I did a publishing project in college where we had to take a book and we had to put together a marketing plan as if we were marketing it now. And we had to put together not just like the cover art and the packaging, we also had to edit it and talk about what we would change. And I had to take a scalpel to a book that I very much love, but there are things in the book that just don't translate well to now. Not just the fact that the social structure has changed a bit, but even just some of Barry's prose and the language and the words that he chooses to describe things feel too old for modern children to really get into.
Yeah, and then like our lexicon continues to develop. But even on a societal level, like you as an American, you know, a filthy colonial, if you will, and you know, me over here in the UK. There was a Wordle on the other day, and it's okay, it's in the past, but it involved a 5-letter word in America that is a 6-letter word in the UK. That vowel that was missing from the Wordle was U. The word was humor.
Oh yeah.
And it like
okay.
It took me until like the second last guess to go, oh, hang on a sec, I need to think like an American. And I did it. I went, you. There's a U in that. That shouldn't even be a word I'm trying to consider. But
humor, color, yeah.
But it's weird. It's weird how words that we think of as perfectly normal, we know in 50 years' time, people are going, that's a very old-fashioned word.
Yes. Yes.
And that changes how we perceive the narrative. It changes the meaning of the narrative because there's now an association with it being archaic.
Yes.
So something that it's something I remark on about, like, say, internet slang and a lot of words that develop over time. One of the ones that came across as soon as I started doing videos was the word Chad to describe certain male. He's such a Chad. I'd go and look it up. But the weird thing about that is, in 5 years, that is going to be a very dated reference.
Yes.
That is not one of the words that's going to survive.
Sure.
But sometimes there are strange words that sort of rise up and they remain with us. But it changes how things sound in a text. Like the Worst Witch books, which preceded Harry Potter, are very similar in a number of regards, although J.K. Rowling has said on the record that she wasn't aware of them. She wasn't aware of this best-selling children's series of novels, and she wasn't aware of the TV adaptation that was shown on one of the 5 channels that we had, and was a very popular. I
went to college with the Worst Witch, actually. Georgina Sherrington and I went to Princeton together.
Really?
Yeah.
That I didn't know. After this, we're going to have to. There will be a secret talk while you spill the beans.
She's wonderful. She's absolutely wonderful. But it is. I actually had forgotten that was a series of novels before it became the show that she was in as a teenager.
Yeah, but that TV show, and even when you look at those novels, the language of those novels, when we look at them now, feels dated. It feels old-fashioned. When we look at Enid Blyton, ignoring just for a moment some of the social and racial and that stuff of Enid Blyton, which shows it being dated, looking only at the language, even the language she uses, her sentence structure, her syntax, her grammar, that it feels old and older than the much more relaxed forms that we have with modern writing.
Agreed. Even the length of the chapters of books is dated, because I'm thinking of some of Frances Hodgson Burnett's books, which many of those Victorian books were serialized. And so they were longer. The chapters ended in places to keep you on cliffhangers, but you could write a book with not only longer sentences, but just longer chapters, like longer pages before you get to the end of a chapter for children of a specific era. And that was fine. Whereas I would argue that children's attention spans are different. how much they read and how they focus is different. And so you can see that as a marker of the evolution of children's and young adult literature, along with the language as well. I was thinking, there's a line in Peter and Wendy at the end of the book when the boys are back and Mr. and Mrs. Darling are going to adopt the lost boys, and they're trying to figure out where the hell they're going to put all of these children. That they had 3, now they have like 10. And Wendy says, oh, they can sleep in the living room. We'll just put the beds away on first Thursdays. And first Thursdays were when ladies made their social calls to other homes. And so they would have to be gone so that people could do that, which is a reference that no one gets now. So that cannot be there in a book for children. Even I would imagine children in Britain would have trouble understanding precisely what is meant by that.
Even I'll put it to you that even adults living in the UK would have difficulty with that reference, because that is not a cultural norm anymore. And it has fallen so far to the wayside that even knowing about it involved research to find that out.
Yes, it did. Yes, it did.
But it's interesting you mentioned chapter length, because this is a weird thing that I find, because obviously I'm doing a read-along of the Malazan books, and Erickson uses sometimes extraordinarily long chapters. And people go, why are the chapters so long? And you go, but what does chapter length have to do with anything? Everything is still broken into sentences, paragraphs, scenes, and there is a scene break. What does the length of chapter have to do with anything? And yet, chapter length has to do with perception of progress, perception of pacing, and a feeling of accomplishment in the reader.
Yes.
And I think this is actually a psychological thing that we find, or at least this would be my guess, and you can tell me if I'm wrong. Shorter chapter lengths in children's books give them the sense that they are progressing through the narrative. I give them a sense of accomplishment, and therefore it is a reward. Look how many chapters you have read. And they feel like they are accomplishing something. Whereas in adult fiction, they don't need to be short chapters because we're adults and we know it doesn't matter how long the chapter is, it's still the same number of words.
Yes.
Whether you have 5 chapters covering 20,000 words or you have 2 chapters covering 20,000 words, it's still 20,000 words.
Agreed. And I also think that when we're looking at children's literature, and you brought up Winnie the Pooh, and I think it's a perfect example, is not only are you looking at children learning to read and learning to enjoy the accomplishment of doing that, and I think the reward with chapters is part of that, you're also looking at books that are being read by parents to children. And so there's a collective reading experience that you have to keep in mind as you're writing and as you're pacing. It's funny, I look at my best friends, all of whom have small children now. And so I've given them many of the same books, one of which is Winnie the Pooh. And what they've told me is, as they read this to their children, oh my God, I can't wait to get to the next chapter. Like I'll say, oh, we can stay up 5 more minutes so I can get to the end of this. And so for them, they're understanding this story from a very different standpoint than their children are, where their children are like internalizing some things. And for the parents, it's okay, I'm gonna break it here and the kid's gonna go to sleep and then I'm gonna go to sleep. So I think even just the structure of reading time is just so different because of the sort of multi-generational experience that you're having when you're talking about children's books. And I think one of the reasons why Winnie the Pooh works as sort of a timeless book is because I think that there are fewer, because it was taken from Christopher Milne's actual life, and his father used that as the fodder for the basis of the books. I think it's so child-focused that a lot of those dated references aren't there. And I also think that it's short enough that you can read it with a child and they feel like they've gotten a full experience. And the adult also isn't sort of overwhelmed by having to get through all of this stuff and also explain it to a child. So I think it works. And then there's the nostalgia factor of having, read it at 5 and now you're 35 and you're reading it to your 5-year-old. And so I think there's a lot that works really well in that book. But I think with adult books, you're right. You don't have to think about the adult reading experience or the adult exhaustion quite so much, because if I'm really tired, I'll put the bookmark in there. I'll know exactly where I'm going to pick up the next time I pick it up and I'm going to go. Whereas that's less the case with the child. And there is more here's where we were, here's what's happening. Like you have to find those natural breaks. And so I think you're right in the way that you're analyzing these.
Yeah, but you also brought up a brilliant point there, which I hadn't considered, which is, so much children's fiction is almost intended to be, or not, even if it's not intended to be read to a child, is meant to be able to be read to a child. So if you think of how that affects the prose and the structure and how the story is being narrated, if you write with the intention as being read aloud, that's very different to writing with the intention that someone is reading and internalizing it. Because when you read aloud, you have to take into account breath breaks and the natural rhythm of speech. Even though it is exposition, you're still trying to formulate it as someone speaking. So it's almost like a different rhetorical device being used. But when we see that transition into young adult, clearly young adult isn't intended to be read to the narrative.
Very true.
The audience is meant to be reading it themselves. So I think that might actually be something that you just suggested. I went, I had never considered that.
I also think, and not that this doesn't happen in children's literature, because it does, I think, going off of your point, that with young adult literature, you are sort of freed of the constraints of it needing to be read aloud to a group of children or a singular child. I think you also see a greater experimentation with form of novel than you will with children's literature. So for instance, there are young adult novels that I've reviewed professionally that are all in will all be in poetry, or all be in or you're experimenting with how you're delivering that content. Whereas I think you're much more tied to a traditional form for things that are meant to be read to children, because there's extra work on the parent to explain some of those things. So for instance, there are books on my shelf right now. I'm thinking of some of Barbara Lemon's. She's this beautiful author illustrator, and the books are wordless. The children's, the picture books are wordless. And so you can do those with children, but there's a lot more heavy lifting on the part of the adult to explain, without the benefit of the words, what's going on there. Whereas as a grad student, which is where I first encountered her, I was sort of blown away by the brilliance of the storytelling without a single word on the page.
Yeah.
And so I haven't purchased those for my nieces and nephew yet, because their parents would murder me and made them do that at bedtime. I will purchase them for them in a few years when they're older and where some of the, they'll be able to internalize that a bit more. And so that's a long-winded way of me saying, I think that you are correct in that form and structure of the novel is able to fundamentally be changed and experimented with based on the audience and the age of the people to whom you're marketing the book.
Yeah, because I think going from very early sort of children's picture books, where so much of it is written in rhyme, very obvious end rhyme, or end of phrasing rhyme. So down by the cool of the pool, it's all about the sound of words, and that's clearly linked to children learning to read. Or this is the duck driving home in his truck. This is the rock that the truck then struck. This is the quack of an angry duck as he jumps down into the muck. It was something like that about the duck in the truck. And again, it's looking at a whole load of rhyming words, because it's teaching, and there's a natural rhythm to so much of it that it's written in short phrases, nice, easy rhymes to show the end of the phrase, and it all works together for children. And then when we move into, I suppose, children's books, because I remember as a kid getting lots of short story collections. Stories for 5-year-olds, stories for 7-year-olds, stories for 9-year-olds, these collections. And quite often they were fairy tales. They were sanitized forms of fairy tales, that the prose was rendered rather simplistically to make it easier for me to read on my own. They weren't designed to be read to me, but they were very much in that telling style that I was familiar with from the children's stories that were read to me. And you move through this level of, then you start internalizing it and you're reading it yourself, and greater sophistication. And then at your point that when we get to young adult, that's when really there's more of a chance to experiment, because the reader has learned all of the basic structures and rules. They are now practiced enough that let's start breaking some of the rules or bending the rules, because that's going to provide variety. It's going to provide interest.
I'm trying to think of a book that I think works very well there. Actually, the one that is on my shirt, Norton Justice, the Phantom Tollbooth, I think is one of those, because the audience it targets are people who are literate enough that they understand how books work, and so like the way that he's playing with language and literature in there only works if you are old enough and seasoned enough to understand the jokes that are in there. So like, for instance, Milo, the protagonist, has to rescue the princess's rhyme and reason, the rescue of rhyme and reason. Like, you have to understand what that means. Otherwise, you lose some of the fun of the book. Or that they jump to the Isle of Conclusions, jumping to conclusions. Like, you have to know what a conclusion is in order for that to actually matter. So I agree with you that it is a freeing of the author from the constraints of teaching, and then there's a different sort of interplay between the author and reader when you have a more sophisticated reader.
Yeah, and then even moving from very obvious metaphors and symbols and things that are clearly established, just like you said, like jumping to the Isle of Conclusions. That is a very clear, it's signaled in the text. And then I think one of the things that we get when we transition even further into adult fiction is that quite often authors go, I don't need to make it that obvious anymore. I will just use the symbol, or I will disguise it slightly so it is less obvious. And then we start dealing with subtext and a lot of the underlayers of literary construction that maybe are not as visible, prominent, or prized in young adult. And I think I would do it a disservice to say that young adult is very surface level about a telling of a story. I don't think that's correct. I think young adult has definite themes. It has lots of subtext running through it. But quite often, that isn't as important almost as the establishment of who the character is, to get the person to reader to identify with the character, because that is so important to, I think, the formation of teenage mentality and conscience and their engagement with reading, seeing themselves in the text. So it's difficult because, like, we see this with adult books as well.
Sure, we do. But I think that you're onto something there, because I'm trying to think of a good book that will sort of reflect that. I was thinking one of the hallmarks, I think, of Victorian and Edwardian literature, because it's written for adults, is that there's a lot that is left unexplained, whether it's Latin phrases that are in there that are purposely not translated because people of a certain class know Latin, and if you know, you know, and if you don't, look it up. So there are things like that that get put into those books as
Rodney, I would have to say, if you don't understand this, then why are you reading this book in the first place, you pleb?
I actually have always taken it as a point of pride that I was fluent in Latin and ancient Greek for a long time, and so I was able to look at those things and be like, yes, okay, great. But I also went to a school that was run by British monks, so that,
Well, also you are frighteningly intelligent as well, which is something I am very envious of.
Thank you.
But anyway, carrying on with your point.
I think that you are correct, that when we're looking at adult books, I do think, characterization is important. I think that making the identification point between the reader and the character is sometimes less important. And I think that's one of the differences, I believe, between young adult fantasy and some of the adult fantasy that we think of. And I'm thinking, if we look at Lloyd Alexander's The Chronicles of Prydain, which is a series that I absolutely adore, and you look at Lord of the Rings, I would say there's a lot of time taken in the first book, the book of 3 of Alexander's The Chronicles of Prydain, to help you identify with Taran. He's an orphan, he's in a specific situation, these things happen to him, he has insecurities. And so I think that Alexander wrote this character at an age and in a way to hook his middle grade to young adult readers so that they will then follow along and mature with him. Rowling does the same thing with Harry Potter. Whereas I think even in The Hobbit, we understand Bilbo, and Bilbo's character changes over the course of an entire novel. And so I don't think we're meant to identify with him from the very beginning in order to go on that journey. I think the fact that we don't identify with him and that this world is sort of foreign is actually part of the appeal. And seeing him become more familiar over time is one of the things that makes that book a joy. And in The Lord of the Rings, I think the world building is so broad, so big, that we are not deeply emotionally invested in those characters as much as we are in the world and the story and what is happening and the defeat of evil. I think we're living in a different type of world building because he doesn't have to hook us in that way. And it's almost not the point of being able to do that.
Yeah, well, I mean, even in the Hobbit, when you think of the scene of the dwarves arriving, there's such silliness to that you can imagine that absurdism and the silliness and the fact that this Hobbit's getting all upset and the dwarves are just eating everything and throwing things around, that we can laugh at that. We're not trying to identify with Bilbo, but we're just sort of going, like, the whole situation is funny. But when we see in The Lord of the Rings, the sign of the door about party business only, it's much more serious in tone, and that playfulness, even though there's still humor in aspects of when hiding from the Sackville Bagginses, but the playfulness is gone. That it's a much more serious tone. And Frodo, like, one of the hilarious things is we always think of Frodo as being very young, but
he's an adult.
Not young. What
he's
is
an adult.
Is it 70 or something?
So, and I mean, even by Hobbit years, he would be at worst a young adult, not worst, but like at lowest age, like a young adult. But he would still be considered, and he's an adult when he's going on this journey. I mean, and I think if you think about the movies and you think that Elijah Wood, I think, sort of has made a pact with the devil where he's never going to age, so he just looks so young that you can think of him being a child. He's not a child. And even Bilbo is certainly not a child. He's younger than he is when we find him in Lord of the Rings, but he's not a child. Whereas I think part of making something appealing to children is the fact that not only is this a child who's the protagonist, but it's that perspective that you're going through. In most children's and young adult fiction, the adults are on the periphery, if they're there at all. The hallmark of a lot of these adventure stories, classic and I think modern too, with the home and away and home journey, is we leave the parents behind. I think it's one of the reasons why everyone loves to write about orphans, because they can get into stuff that, like, no one who has parents in the room is going to allow their kid to like, go off and do this crazy stuff.
But also, like, adults quite often are the bad guys. Adults are the villains. So you can see that, you know, the adults are the ones always telling us we're not allowed to do stuff. You go, there's a reason why we tell you not to play with matches. You know, it's not to ruin your fun. It's because you might burn the house down. And from a mature perspective, you go, you know, I'm identifying with the adult in the room saying, don't play with matches. But as a kid, I go, like, but I want to play with matches. It looks really cool. But when, like, if you think like Scooby-Doo or the Three Investigators or the Hardy Boys or like even the Enid Blyton, the Famous Five, the Secret Seven, it's the adults are on the periphery, or the adults are bad people who the kids band together and they take down the evil adult who was ruining their fun. That you can see that very easy psychological point of connection of adults bad and us kids or us teenagers, we're good.
Or you're also just not. I was talking to I directed the original stage play of Peter Pan when I was a senior at Princeton, and I when I was making my directing choices, it was entirely child focused. It's a coming of age. Everything is predicated on Wendy, and I was joking with the actor who played Peter Pan and Captain Hook that if I was doing it now, I would care much more about Mr. and Mrs. Darling, who I cared much less about when I was 21 and doing this thing, because now I'm 30, almost 38, and I have a stepdaughter, and I understand the parental perspective so much more than I did. And I think that's one part of the beauty of children's literature, is that in that instance, Peter gets the Darling children out the window and the Darlings get home just too late to be able to stop it. So they're not bad parents because they tried to stop it, but the kids are out the window, so now they can go and do whatever the heck they want, and then they'll eventually come home. And then you have the adult Captain Hook, who is the bad guy. So we still get to deal with adults, but we're dealing with them through the lens of a child, where we don't have to fully understand them because they're not understanding them is not the point. The child learning about the world is the point. Whereas in adult books, in some ways that gets flipped if you have children who are in the books and are prominent, or even if they're the protagonist. And I'm trying to think of a book that I think does that really well. Well, I mean, we were talking about Lord of the Rings. I think that does that well, because you see younger characters in here, but we don't invest in them in quite the same way that you do in like a Harry Potter, where you have to be deeply rooting for him for this to go. I mean, we're rooting for Bilbo, but we're really just rooting for Sauron not to destroy the world and plunge it into evil. And these characters have a part to play in preventing that. And so we care about them. But I can't say that I deeply love Aragorn and Arwen, and I'm like emotionally invested in them the way that I am in books from my childhood that were focused on me and for me.
But even like thinking of the film Battle Royale, which is a stunning dystopian sort of update of Lord of the Flies, and then the young adult Hunger Games.
Yep.
Was it Mockingjay? Was that the first one, or was the first one
Hunger Games, Catching Fire, then Mockingjay?
Okay, but when we think of the framing of Battle Royale, that is very much these teenagers are tearing the place apart, and they've just been dumped on an island. Go, whoever survives, that's it. But when we see it in the Hunger Games, it's all tied into the perspective of Katniss as our hero. Yes. And these evil adults are betting on all of these kids doing this stuff. And you see that dichotomy that isn't present in Battle Royale. In Battle Royale, the enemy are other kids, are other people the same age. The focus is very, very different. It's much more mature. It's much more frightening. Yes. Whereas in the Hunger Games, it's all about the scrappy young hero is going to survive. And then there's the love triangle working itself in as a very common trope in young adult fiction. It's because who hasn't felt that heartbreak in high school of loving someone and they love someone else, and all of this, it plays into a lot of those melodramatic things. Whereas Battle Royale, much more serious, even though when you look at it sort of from a general point, very similar stories.
They are, and we're pulling from the Theseus and the Minotaur myth, where the 7 youths and the 7 maidens have to get sent as sacrificial tribute to Crete, to Minos. And one of the differences that I see in Battle Royale and the Hunger Games is not just what you're doing with children, but also the construction of Katniss as the person with whom we identify. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So the horror in the Battle Royale is that you see that even children, like humanity can be not inherently bad, but that children can be killers. Like there's we're demystifying the idea of the innocence of children and them having this innate thing, because in put in a situation, they will do the thing that they're supposed to be doing. And we have to wrestle with human nature in that, because it takes away a fundamental belief that we like to have about children, which is that they are these innocent, fragile beings, and we shepherd them sort of through life.
Kids are sociopaths. We all know that.
I mean, and this is why I loved J.M. Barrie got this really well, where he realized how heartless children were in Peter Pan, and he encodes it in that book so well. And I think we have sort of run screaming away from that sort of understanding of what children can be. And if you think about the Hunger Games, what makes it horrifying is not that children are killing each other, but that the adults know that the way to keep the other adults in line is to take the innocence, the future, and turn them into killers. So the idea is these children would never have this in them, except that these adults have forced them into this situation in which they have to do this to survive, and the tragedy of the innocence that's ruined. And and that's a televised death match. And the reason why Katniss works so well as a focal point is that, again, she's basically an orphan because her father is dead, and her mother was so broken by her husband's death that she's basically become unresponsive, and Katniss has to basically be mother and father. So you get the tragedy there. But then you also get the protectiveness of her taking care of Prim, her younger sister, and that's why she goes in to do all of this stuff. And so she is, and there's also the fact that because Katniss has seen femininity, traditional femininity, as a millstone around her neck, it is the feminine love that her mother had for her father that sort of breaks her when her father dies, that she sees no use in femininity. And she's taken on, I mean, she used to hunt with her father. She takes on the masculine identity of the hunter, or huntress, if you want to make her an Artemis creation, so that she is sort of gender bendy in a way that I think appeals to children, because she's not overtly feminine and she's not overtly masculine. And then going into the Hunger Games, she has to learn how to play with gender and to question what gender can be. And I think the introduction of that love triangle sort of helps with that. It's essentially trying to find an identity. What is my identity? She's caught in between identities in District 12, and then she's forced to accept identities in the Hunger Games. Like, she is forced to perform femininity by Haymitch, by Cinna, by the games, because that's how you appeal to adults and you get money and prizes and things to survive. And so I think really, whereas Battle Royale is not about that, we are invested in her because, in the same way that teenagers are trying to find out who they are, Katniss is being forced to do the same thing.
Yeah,
and so I need that to hook people.
Yeah, and I think, you know, that is one of the central conceits of it, because even though you don't expect teenagers to go, oh yeah, I know what it's like to be volunteered as tribute and go and have to fight for my life in a death game. But it's that underlying subtext of, what is your identity? Would you do the right thing? Who are you? And as teenagers, some of us were very lucky in that, oh yeah, I knew exactly who I was my entire life. Mm-hmm. Although I think the majority of us we're on a quest to try to find ourselves, to find out who we were. And there's a lot of sort of in high school and in those teenage years of rejecting authority, some authority that you accept, some authority that you fight against, listening to music you know your parents will hate, or and convincing yourself that you really like it, even though it's a terrible noise. But or also sometimes you do like those things, that there's a rejection of the past and trying to forge your own way forward. That so much of that is tied into Katniss's story. You can see that is the focus and drive of it, which is one of the things I see it as. That's why we can identify it as a young adult. Whereas Battle Royale, again, with a very similar sort of premise, and yet Battle Royale is very clearly not young adult. Battle Royale is something very adult. And it's using child and teenage characters to tell an adult story. And so I think that, and it goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning, that yes, like, it's not just having children in it or having teenagers in it. It's the intentionality of the story. It's the focus of the story, the themes being explored, how it relates to the intended narrative.
I think if you look at certainly the novels, but also the film adaptations of the Hunger Games, think about how much killing you actually see people do. It's for a televised death match, it's surprisingly little killing that you see happen. And the few times you see someone have to kill, like Katniss will kill to save herself, but it's like, I'm doing it from far away. There are ways in which the violence is mitigated in the novels, and certainly in the film adaptations, where all the killing is sort of really pushed away.
Like she uses a bow and arrow, like she can't get further away from them.
Exactly. And then we humanize her. We also humanize Rue in that first book, so that even in this televised deathmatch where children have to kill each other to survive, the death of a child is still looked at as being a tragedy. Which is still, I think, tied to our idea that childhood is innocence and the children are the future and children can't die. I think there's some deeply ingrained beliefs about childhood that you see in those books that battle royale sort of blows up.
But it's very interesting because the death of Rue, we are meant to see as a tragedy. And you go, but the world in which the Hunger Games happens does not see it as a tragedy. So that's clearly something that is from our world. It is intended to be from our world looking in, as opposed to something that is being true to the diegesis. Because if with Rue dying, you would go, yeah, but everyone there is going, oh, I lost my bet.
Yes.
And that's the attitude you would expect in something that was faithfully rendering the story world, that was being faithful to that diegetic reality. But that's not what we get. We get it told in terms of this is tragic. Look at this. This is terrible, which runs counter to the reality created. So we can see that there's an external perspective that is being narrated to, that this is not intended to be a faithful rendering of the reality. Therefore, you can see that artificiality of the construct.
Well, and also, not only is that sense of, well, Rue's death, not only are people losing their bets, but for better or for worse, it advances Katniss one person closer to actually surviving and finishing. Even though Rue is an amazing character, we're not supposed to want her to go. We know she has to for this to end. And so also, and this is a running theme in a lot of children's books, Victorian and I think other, whether or not you're meant to see Rue's death as a tragedy, that Katniss sees it as a tragedy, that she drapes her and dresses her and does all of this, is meant to show her humanity, her sort of giving the middle finger to the system. And if you don't see it as a tragedy, you are part of the problem. You are part of the problem of the system, because we're supposed to see it from that point of view. And this is the case in a lot of books. I'm thinking of the book A Little Princess, the Frances Hodgson Burnett book. The way that you judge goodness and badness in the book is by whether or not people recognize the innate worth of Sarah Crewe, both before she loses her money and more importantly afterwards. And Miss Minchin is bad because she doesn't recognize it. Like, that she is good is immutable fact. We're not supposed to think about the fact that her father's money comes from diamond mines, it's part of colonialism, and he's clearly helping to subjugate India, and like, we don't care about any of that stuff. She is the innocent, fragile waif who is now sort of tossed into the gutter. And if you recognize that she is still a princess inside, even though she's in rags, then you are good. But Miss Minchin doesn't see that, and so she's bad. Even though in the world that she lives in, having a child for whom she bought all of this stuff on credit, knowing that the parents were going to pay her back and now there's no money to pay for it, puts her in a horrible position and saddles her with a child who she has to take care of contractually, but is not going to be paid for, is awful. But we're not supposed to think about that. We're not supposed to humanize Miss Minchin. We're supposed to see her as horrid because Sarah is who we like, and Miss Minchin doesn't love her.
Yeah, well, it's and I think this is, I mean, one of what I was trying to get at with, sometimes I think young adult fiction is much more direct in sort of putting the reader in a position, this is what you are meant to think, that it is far less about the ambiguity of the complex morality of the world. And that's not true of all young adult fiction, but I think as a general sort of rule or a general trend, that young adult fiction is much more direct in telling a narrative and saying, you are meant to feel this way, regardless of whether or not, when you take a step back and look at the objective facts of what's going on, you go, hang on a sec, that isn't right. And I think it's unfortunate that so many are told this way, because when we get to adult fiction that is deliberately playing with that complex morality, that we've been trained almost to expect, well, if we're told they're bad in the story, then clearly they are bad. And it's a very difficult lesson to unlearn.
I think you're right. Well, I also think that a lot of our media has colluded in us telegraphing villainy and heroism in such obvious ways that you're not meant to do that. I know you and I were talking before we started recording about Disney and the fact that they have literally color-coded villainy for you. That when you see the person, I mean, you look at someone like, let's take Sleeping Beauty, for instance. We have this like regal king, this beautiful blonde queen, and this blonde hair, blue-eyed cherub baby. The doors burst open, and in comes Black Maleficent with black horns and black and gray clothes and purple and green. We know she's a villain from the moment the music changes and the doors fly open. Like, no one's in the dark about the fact that she's going to be the evil one here. We can see it in the color. Aurora is blonde, and therefore she's good, and Maleficent is black and dark, and therefore she's evil. Before she even utters a word, we know it.
Scar and Simba. Even the hyenas in The Lion King. You know, it's Disney. I think Disney has done an awful lot to harm how we understand narrative and how we understand a lot of these things, because it trained us to expect that. So many of us grew up watching Disney movies, and because they use that very simplistic and simplified iconography, because they use the same techniques time and time again, that's what we grew to understand. Not just us, but other like creative people, writers and screenplay writers and directors, that is a lesson that we learned very early on. And so we map it quite often into other narratives, maybe unknowingly or unconsciously. Because think of the number of times that we've seen evil being depicted through someone being disfigured or having a visual deformity of some kind, that is a signifier. Oh, don't trust them, that, you know, they are evil, they look ugly. Or if they are poor, poorness sometimes is projected as a good people are look decent and have a middle class lifestyle. But if you're evil, you're either super wealthy or really poor, because if you're poor, you haven't worked your way up. You haven't pulled yourself up by your bootstraps.
Yes.
You know, it's there's some frighteningly simplistic moral aspects to a lot of this iconography that are so pervasive that it's very hard not to recognize them when they are being used, but also to unlearn why you have that reaction.
I agree. Well, and the Victorians really did sort of traffic in this in a lot of the fiction that was produced there. That I mean, it's called physiognomy, that your outward appearance is a direct reflection of your inward worth. And you can think about, if we're going to look at fairy tales, think about Cinderella. And if you think about not the Disneyfied or even the Charles Perrault version, but if you think about the Grimm version, the sisters are beautiful of face and vile and black of heart. Like, so their outward appearance is a complete odds with their innate cruelty. By the end of the story, their outward appearance reflects their innate cruelty, because one has had to chop off a toe to fit into the slipper and nearly bled to death. One has chopped off a heel to do it, so they're physically disfigured. They're also blinded by the birds on Cinderella's wedding day when they go to try and curry favor with her. So they were too blind to see Cinderella's innate worth, and so they can't see anymore, and they're physically deformed to reflect the fact that they're evil, whereas she has always been beautiful and pure and good. And so her physiognomy reflects that, and then she sort of socially ascends.
But then when we think of the adaptations, where you see that transition, which is, you know, obviously a clear, explicit metaphor, but in the adaptations, the evil stepsisters are ugly to begin with.
Yep.
And there's no nuance here. They're ugly on the outside, they're ugly on the inside.
Yes.
We've lost even that very straightforward metaphor has disappeared, because apparently we're not complex enough to get it.
No, that's true.
It's like true. Kids aren't stupid. Like, we can work these things out, but I think it's one of the frustrations I've had with trying to read young adult literature as an adult is I don't like stories being dictated to me. I like the freedom we get in adult fiction of exploring and the ambiguity and all of these things. But with young adult fiction, so much of it is a story being told to you, and you have to believe this. And this person is good because I tell you they are good, and they are then going to do this thing, and this is good. But frighteningly, we see that as the mode of storytelling in a lot of the blockbuster, say, superhero movies.
Yes.
Tony Stark is a hero, despite the fact that he's a serial killing sociopath who has a lot of misogynist tendencies
Yes.
and is a bad person.
But Robert Downey Jr. plays him well, and so we love him.
And he is, like, Robert Downey Jr. plays him as this roguish, accessible, funny, suave, brilliant, witty guy. And you forget that, like, he just kills people. Like, he's not a nice guy.
I think it's funny. I was having this conversation with students this week, looking at narrative in the Marvel universe and then in other works. And so I do think you're right that there is a flattening of narrative when it comes to superhero film, because there's a specific arc they want to take us on, and you have to be able to telegraph like who is good and who is bad. And we complicate that sometimes. So Loki has become an anti-hero, and so he's been given the ability to do that. But one of the things that I find endlessly frustrating about a lot of these adaptations within comic universes is that there's only, when we tell origin stories, we destroy the ambiguity of characters to give us this sort of pat, like, sad, like, this person had childhood trauma, and so therefore this is why they were doing what they're doing. We did it with Boba Fett. They tried to do it with Han Solo. They just did it with Cruella de Vil. I don't understand how you try to make Cruella de Vil like morally ambiguous. Like, she's a villain, and it's fine that she's a villain. Like, she wants to kill puppies. It really doesn't get more villainous than that because she wants a coat. I mean, I think that's okay to have.
Maybe she was cold, and it's important to have a coat.
But it is weird that we have this sort of compulsive mania, I think particularly in America, that someone cannot just be evil. We have to understand the sort of sadness behind them, that where they're actually really good on the inside. They have just, like, because of this, learned to do evil things, but they're like, it's as if we can't accept that, yes, people are complex, and there also are times when people do bad things. And it isn't because they're innately good or whatever that you need to hold on to be able to connect to them, that sometimes they've just done bad things.
Yeah, but, and it's, I think that there is a necessary point about, okay, some people are evil, they are villains. We don't necessarily have to understand every aspect of how they got there. But I think sometimes it is actually interesting when we see villains that are believable, that they are not just mustachio twirling villains for the sake of villainy because they're villains and like to do villainous things. That I think we've moved past that as a reason for villainy, except obviously if you're, writing a James Bond script. Well, but I find it very frustrating when we have villains who are villainous for villainy sake, and there's no motivating factor. There's no understandable reason. I want to destroy the world. Why? Because I want to. Well, okay.
That I agree with.
Did someone steal your lunch money when you were a kid? Is that what this is about? Understanding that as a motivation, it doesn't mean I'm going to like them anymore or go, they're less villainous now. But at least it gives me an understanding of their motivation, why they are a villain. And so, like, I don't mind someone like Cruella de Vil having an origin story that sort of shows her evolution to become a villain. What I don't like is when we are forced to try and sympathize with her. And there's a difference between understanding and extending sympathy and empathy.
Yes.
Like, Draco Malfoy is evil.
Yes.
But as we were discussing, Draco Malfoy and Harry Potter are mirrors of one another. The similarities between them outweigh any of the differences. They are so close together in terms of their construction. And yet Malfoy is evil because he's evil. And the abuse that he suffered that made him that way, all of those aspects are never really dug into in Harry Potter. Because I think to understand a lot of that stuff would have ruined him as a childish foil. And of course, the first couple of books are that very childish approach to things of, well, I don't like him, he's bad. And it lacks nuance because children of that age lack nuance. And I think when we get those little glimpses of insight into Malfoy's life and family life and relationships in the later books, that reflects the growing nuance of the reader, and Rowling writing to that reader and saying it isn't just as straightforward as good, evil, even though Voldemort is evil because he's evil for reasons.
I also think there's an unmistakable class element to the evil in with Malfoy and Harry that allows us to not think about the similarities of them, and I'll explain what I mean. So Harry is, when we meet him, he is poor. He is living in a broom closet, essentially, underneath the stairs. He is abused by these horrible people who treat him badly just because they don't like where he has come from or who he is. And we know that disliking people for who they are is bad. Mm. And so we're able to forget about the fact that he, when he gets to the Wizarding World, is actually fabulously wealthy. And we don't have to think about that because our construction of him is as the poor, orphaned hero with whom we are meant to identify. And Malfoy is as abused as Harry, but the trappings in which he is abused are very different. He's abused in a mansion with servants, and he's abused by, in the same way that Harry is, by like lack of attention and cruelty. But because he's rich, overtly rich, we're not really supposed to think about what has happened to make him the way that he is. Because his father throws money at the problem, his mother isn't able to show the love that she feels that we see in the later books until the very end. And so he has been neglected. But I think this gets to a sort of a classism of, we don't want to sympathize with really rich people. We want to hate
apart from Harry.
Yes. Well, and he's only rich in the one world, not in the other world. So it's almost like, well, you know, okay. Whereas Malfoy is rich all the time and has these views that were given to him by his parents. So he is they are both products of their abusive upbringing. Yeah. But because Harry's has a more sad origin, like there are two dead parents and then the surrogate parents are abusive, and Malfoy has an quote-unquote intact family and all of the trappings that we think of as not only normal but aspirational. We don't think about him as an abused person. We think about him as a villain.
Yeah. I find like constructions of morality and the constructions of good and evil is always one of those aspects of literature I am fascinated by, particularly in fantasy, because we get so used to the number of people when you're reading a book and you go, but who are the good guys? Who are the bad guys? Who am I rooting for? You know, why do you need to know who to root for? Surely you should be reading and come to that. But what we want is, we want certainty. We want to know we're on the right side. And I think that's actually a holdover from children's and young adult fiction coming up through into other genres, is that
I agree.
We like that certainty. We like to know that we are reading on the side of good. And even when we talk about morally ambiguous characters, because paragons of virtue have fallen out of favor in fantasy. The whole, the whiter than white, the more moral than moral, the gooder than good. We like heroes that have feet of clay. But again, there are only certain feats of clay that we will let them away with.
Yes.
There are acceptable defects for a hero to have, and there are unacceptable defects for heroes to have, which is a fascinating breakdown of morality.
Well, I think, and you and I, this fits with Harry, and I also think it fits with someone else you and I were talking about earlier, which is James Bond. So James Bond is a killer. And one of the things that I think the Craig films do that I don't love is that by giving us his sort of sad origin story where like his parents died and we get to see the house where they lived and all of the, we get the poor wounded boy. And we can sympathize with a poor wounded orphan boy and give him a lot of leeway because he didn't have what Malfoy has, which is the two parents in the house doing the thing that they're supposed to be doing. And we give that person much less leeway because they have been given a traditional family structure and they have been given access to wealth. And so therefore those things should solve the problems. Whereas I do think we give people who are damaged in a specific way a lot of grace in terms of what they do in character development. Look at Bruce Wayne and Batman, where he is a killer also, but we also know that he watched his parents be murdered in front of him. And so we're willing to give him some leeway that he's working through those demons. And we also, and he uses the wealth to become Batman. So it's interesting the way that we do bend morality when the origins or surroundings of the character suit us. Tony Stark, the one that you gave up, is a perfect example. We hear about his complicated relationship with his father, and that helps to excuse a lot of personality defects.
But I mean, when I think of Iron Man 2, where you have Ivan Vanko being introduced at the start of the film, where his father has been screwed over essentially by Tony's dad, because he was the co-inventor of the arc reactor. So he looks at the basic blueprints of the arc reactor and he builds his own prototype thing, exactly mimicking what Tony did. And we see that he's grown up in abject poverty. He has dirty fingernails, he has dirty teeth, he has dirty, greasy hair. He's poor and he's Russian. Even though he's a genius inventor, he's a genius engineer, staggering level of intellect and talent. And let's face it, his family were basically screwed over by Stark's family. And we see this in contrast to Tony. So if this was an origin story about a hero, this would all be framed as he is a victim.
Yes.
But it's not. This is the origin story of a villain.
Yes.
And you go, it's exactly the same sequence of events, but clearly we are meant to dislike him. We are meant to think of him as a villain. And when the film is framed, Tony is dealing with the sins of the father. He's dealing with the repercussions of his father's legacy. He's dealing with his own mortality and trying to deal with all of this and fix these problems of the past. This, you would think this narrative trajectory, he would meet Ivan Vanko, they would have this initial clash, and then he would realize when he digs into it, my God, my dad really messed your family up. We should not be enemies. We should be brothers. Come join me. Together we will. And you can see that's the natural trajectory of that film. But that's not what the film wants. So it's no, he's a bad guy. It's just going to continue him being bad, and we'll just carry on with that, and he's a villain.
Yes.
And we watch all of this and we just accept it because of the coding.
Yep.
We're dirty Russian and the hero is wealthy, Urban, American. You know, it is so, the diametric opposition of the two is meant to show us these things. But when you think of the facts, Vanko should not be the villain.
No. Well, and something else that, and you said something I wanted to come back to, something else that colludes in Tony being able to be heroized or be made into a hero is that all the sins are his father's. So he really, we don't have to focus on his defects because the sins of the father are so great and he's trying to sort of clean up that mess. So he is the villain the hero, by virtue of doing that. And so we also don't have to think about what has created this villain, what has brought him here, and Tony can beat him down because Tony didn't screw him over. His father did that. His father's also dead. So there's no live person to hold accountable. And on some level, we are supposed to feel that Tony shouldn't be held accountable because he was a child and didn't do these things. And the idea of us being coded with certain things as being heroic, you and I were talking earlier about wealthy and urbane European as relates to Twilight and the sort of the makeup in there, where Edward is sophisticated and wealthy and erudite and plays the piano, and he is this gentlemanly gentleman that allows us to excuse the fact that he stalks Bella, watches her, breaks into her home, to ignore a lot of the archaic gender ideas that he has that have brought him there. We also are able to ignore the fact that while he has a 16-year-old body physically, he's like 200 years old, and she's actually 16. So these are not two 16-year-olds falling in love and figuring it out. they're a 16-year-old and a 200-year-old who just happens to look really young.
He had an excellent skincare routine that he used at night.
Exactly. And so we have him who we are supposed to want her to be with because he is everything that we are taught a successful person should be. And as you said, you look at Jacob and the Native Americans, and they are swarthy, they are darker, they are earthy, they are less educated in a traditional sense. They turn into werewolves. They are brutish in that way. And so like there's an animalistic quality to the brown skinned natives that the erudite Cullens, who only eat animals as a way to show their civility, that they don't touch humans, also elevates them even more.
And we even have the Cullens all drive really expensive, fancy sports cars.
Yes.
And we see that Jacob is riding around on a dirt bike.
Yep.
And like it's so blatant, the structure and the construction of these. And when Jacob comes to the high school, it's everyone sneering at him and saying, "What are you doing off the reservation? Why are you at our school?"
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Whereas when the vampires walk in, it's like, oh yes, they own the place and they're all gorgeous and they're all wonderful.
Yes.
That alienation, but the social constructions attached to it and the material constructions attached to it, it really is it's a fascinating aspect of the books that is often ignored by people who read it.
It is. Well, and it telegraphs whether she, and I'm not saying that Stephanie Meyer intended to do this, but I do think it is working with some very old tropes about race and class that persist to this day, where like Edward is the man you marry, Jacob is the man you fool around with before you get married.
But like we were told, like even in Dracula and in a lot of the Victorian fiction, the discussion around Darwinism and evolution and how it was misunderstood and how anyone who was not viewed as white European educated class at the top end was seen lower down on the scale, closer to the ape-like. And that included the Irish. Like the Irish were always pictured as lower down on the scale, that they had not, the Irish hadn't fully evolved yet, that we weren't fully human. And I know that you can understand, because a lot of that racist iconography we see expanded into other cultures, particularly like America, and how it was applied to people of color in America. The same language, the same depictions over and over again of this idea of less evolved, more animal-like, more bestial, and less civilized.
Well, and it's funny you bring that up, because part of the eugenics movement in America was to prove that the Irish were not actually white. You were actually Black people who had just migrated a little too far north, and so your skin, there were scientists who were trying to prove that the Irish were in fact Black. So we're treating them the same because they are in fact the same. They just kind of look a little different, but don't be fooled.
And you go, like, when you start digging into this stuff and you realize like the abject stupidity of this stuff, that let's face it, I'm about the whitest person you know. Like, I'm pale. I'm really pale. I can get moonburn. That's how pale I am. So we had a quick break there, but I think maybe, Rodney, we've covered a lot of ground in this discussion, and it has been incredibly valuable for me, because this is an area I can make sort of educated guesses at, but it's not an area I've spent time researching the same way that you have. So I really do want to thank you for bringing your expert opinion in to help guide me and teach me, because what I want to do with a lot of these discussions, it's about learning, both my learning and everyone else's, that we help each other learn from other people's expertise. So like, thank you very much for this discussion.
Thank you for bringing me here and allowing me to have it. I love talking about this. And I think, just as sort of a final thought, your interrogation of children's literature versus adult literature and young adult, and where those sort of lines lie, I think at the heart of it is the fact that children's literature, to me, is some of the most important that we read because it shapes our initial impressions of the world and it socializes us. If you want to know what any society values, you look at what they read to or taught their children. It tells you everything about who they were at the core. And so I think the burden and I think the privilege of that is why you see some of the differences in these different types and genres of literature.
And I mean, that is an absolutely fantastic point. You see, this could spark an entire conversation, Dr. Fierce, when I have been trying to wrap this up so that we can both like move on with it, because it's nighttime here. I need to go to bed soon. And like, that is a fantastic point, Rodney. So like, and on that bombshell, which I would love to address further, thank you so much, Dr. Fierce. Thank you for coming on the channel. I really do appreciate it. Thank you so much for your time. For those of you still watching, thank you for watching. I appreciate your continued support. It means a lot to me. And we will see you in the next one.